All right, our notes tonight deal with how the colonies grow increasingly dissatisfied in their relationship with Great Britain. So far, we've talked about the Navigation Acts and how that sort of started the process of Great Britain going back on their policy of benign neglect and starting to put rules in place that weren't there before. And the colonies get more and more upset with that. So as we've discussed, the colonies weren't happy with the Navigation Acts, but they weren't going to start a revolution over it. The problems really started getting worse after the French and Indian War. So for part of our notes tonight, we're going to talk about the French and Indian War and what went on there. So we want to start off with just figuring out kind of what's going on. So what was the French and Indian War? Well, what we call the French and Indian War was actually part of a worldwide war between Britain and France. And this battle, this war between Britain and France, wasn't just taking place in North America. It's going on really all over the world. It's here in North America. It's also in Africa, in Europe, and in India. But what we're going to focus on is what's happening here. And in America, the British and the colonists are on one side, fighting against the French and their Indian allies on the other side. So it's kind of a funky name. You would think French and Indian War. It sounds like the French and the Indians are fighting each other. We call it that because that's who we were fighting against, the French and the Indians. Why was it fought? Why are Britain and France fighting all around the world? Well, here in America, both sides were fighting over the same land. They both wanted the Ohio River Valley. They both wanted Canada because both sides wanted to control the fur trade. We talked in Unit 1 about how valuable those furs were and how the French and the English wanted to ship those furs back to Europe and make a lot of money off of it. And England and France just straight up didn't like each other. They have been rivals for a very, very long time. And this worldwide war between the two was really just a fight for control and power. So what happened? In America, the battles are mostly fought out in the western part of the colonies towards the Appalachian Mountains and even beyond. Some of the most important battles were out in like Pittsburgh, western Pennsylvania, and up in Canada, there was an incredibly important battle at Quebec. Long story short, the English win the war. They win the war in America, and they win the war in the other parts of the world. So what are the results of that? Some important ones. For the colonists, a lot of them, including a young officer named George Washington, gained a lot of military experience fighting on the side of the British. England got a lot of new land in America. Basically, they took over all of the French colonies in America, including Canada and the Ohio River Valley. So to keep the colonists from getting into fights with the Indians, Britain told the colonists, you may not go west of the Appalachian Mountains. And they stationed soldiers out along the mountains to protect the colonists. And Parliament actually passed a law called the Proclamation of 1763, which made it illegal for the colonists in America to go west into those new lands. So in this picture here, you can see the 13 colonies along the ocean. And then you see that red line. And that red line was put in place by Parliament saying you cannot go west of here. If you go west of there, you're going to start fights with the Indians and we're going to have to come and rescue you. So you're not allowed to go west of there. And you can imagine the colonists are upset by this. They want to go west. They want to move into these open lands. So a couple other results that you need to understand. The war cost a ton of money. So did paying to keep the army in the colonies, right? They're going to leave some soldiers in the colonies to protect America. So Britain's national debt doubles. So Britain owes a lot of money. And on the other side, France, who lost the war, was angry, and they wanted revenge on Britain. So that's going to come back to haunt England down the road. Now this brings us to the first of the major taxes that Parliament is going to pass to try to make up the money that they lost in the war. And it's called the Stamp Act. And so you see some pictures here. The one on the left is a picture of what some of the stamps themselves actually look like. The one on the right is a colonist viewpoint of how they felt about the stamp. In 1765, after the war ends, Parliament passes this law called the Stamp Act. And the whole purpose of it was to raise money to pay for the cost of the French and Indian War and to have enough money to defend the American colonies. The law required colonists to buy specially stamped paper for really just about anything that required paper. That included legal documents. It included newspapers, licenses that you would need for businesses or even like a marriage license, ship's cargo lists, even things as simple as playing cards. If it was printed on paper, the Stamp Act said you have to buy this specially stamped paper to prove you paid the tax. And Britain had no problem with the Stamp Act. They thought it was fair and necessary for several reasons. One, it wasn't very expensive. It didn't cost a lot. So it wasn't like they were putting a big, heavy tax on the colonies. Another reason they thought it was fair was that people in England paid way more taxes than the colonists did. About 26 times the amount of taxes. England had just paid for a very expensive war to protect the colonies. So they felt it's only fair that the colonies help pay for that. And they felt that this Stamp Act was fair because the money that was being raised would help to defend the colonies and pay for the soldiers that are left over there. So from England's perspective, this tax was not a big deal. The colonists, on the other hand, were very upset about it, mostly because they didn't have any say in the British Parliament. They felt like they could not be taxed by England when they didn't even have any representatives to speak up for them. So the colonists protested hard. Some of the ways they protested: they created a group called the Sons of Liberty. And this group pretty much existed just to stir up opposition to these taxes. They organized anti-Stamp Act marches and rallies. On the slightly more violent side, they would threaten tax collectors and royal officials, sometimes even actually attacking them. Nine colonies out of the 13 decided that they would get together and have a meeting to come up with a strategy. And this was called the Stamp Act Congress, one of the first times that a whole bunch of colonies got together to deal with a problem. And they decided that they would boycott English goods. Boycott means they would refuse to buy it until the tax was repealed or canceled. Said, look, let's all get together and we will not buy anything from England until they get rid of this unfair tax. And we'll also send King George a petition. We'll send him a letter explaining why we think the tax is unfair. So Parliament ends up repealing the Stamp Act. They decide to take it back. But they really didn't take it back because the colonists were complaining, so much as the fact that the boycott was hurting British business owners. When the colonies stopped buying things from Britain, business owners back in Britain got really upset. They were losing money, and they started complaining. So Parliament decides to take back the Stamp Act. But Parliament does do a few things. It says, even though we're going to take the Stamp Act back, we still have the power to tax the colonies. And to prove it, they passed new taxes. So they took away the tax on the stamps and basically just replaced it with a new one on goods like paint and tea and lead and glass. And this was called the Townshend Acts. And Parliament also gave British officials in the colonies the right to search colonial homes and businesses to prevent smuggling or cheating on the taxes. So, thinking about this, you could probably anticipate that the colonies aren't going to be very happy about these new taxes either. So I want you to address the connection question that's on your notes. Go back and rewatch the notes if you need to understand parts that were confusing or to copy down parts that you missed, and answer the connection question as best you can. Print out your notes before our next class.